Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 53 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is available in German and English on YouTube, Spotify and Podcast.de with a social media presence on Blue Sky and Instagram. The topic of this episode. In this episode, I'm talking about Chancellor Joseph Wirth of the Centre Party. He was Chancellor for a year and a half. His time in office saw the London ultimatum regarding reparations, the Third Silesian uprising, and the assassinations of Finance Minister Matthias Erzberger and Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau. He is the source of the famous saying, "The enemy is on the right." I will explain the context in which he made the statement in this episode. Political agenda and background. None. The sources that were used. Source 1. Hans Mommsen, Rise and Fall of the Weimar Republic, 1918-33, Ullstein-Propyläen, Berlin, 1998. Source 2. Bernd Braun, The Chancellors of the Weimar Republic, Kohlhammer Publishing House, Stuttgart, 2013. Source 3. Nadine Rossol, Benjamin Ziemann, Upheaval and Abyss, The Handbook of the Weimar Republic, WBG, Darmstadt, 2021. Source 4. Martin Sabrow, Violence Against Weimar, The Early Republic's Crises, 1918-23, Waldstein Publishing House, Göttingen, 2023. Joseph Wirth was born on September 6, 1879 in Freiburg, the second of three sons. He thus came from the same region as his predecessor Konstantin Fehrenbach and also lived in the same city. However, Fehrenbach was the oldest chancellor of the Weimar Republic. Wirth is the youngest chancellor Germany has ever had, including the era of the German Empire and the Federal Republic. He was only 41 years old when he took office. Wirth's father was a master mechanic at the Herder Publishing House. He enabled his sons to pursue higher education and even university studies. However, the family was not wealthy, as a letter Wirth wrote in 1933 describing the family situation reveals. Excerpts of the letter are printed on page 30 of source 2. Life at my parents' house at Herrenstraße 25 was very simple. When I think about how simply my parents dressed, and how long a dress lasted, or how long my father wore a suit, it seems almost like a fairy tale to me now that they could get by on my father's meager income. One has no idea what sacrifices the last generation made to help their children. Wirth studied mathematics, but also pursued studies in economics, constitutional law, philosophy, and history. He passed his state examination in 1903. Afterward, he served as a mathematics teacher in the secondary school system in Baden, first in Lahr and later in Freiburg. A relationship he had begun as a student teacher ended around this time due to the veto of the woman's father. In 1906, he wrote his doctoral dissertation entitled On the Elementary Divisors of a Linear Homogeneous Substitution. And, as source 2 aptly notes, the title alone leaves a non-mathematician rather perplexed. Wirth remained a teacher until 1914. He only quit his job when he was elected to the Reichstag in 1914. Unlike the chancellors discussed so far, Wirth lived in a politically active household. His father served for 25 years on the Citizens' Committee in Freiburg, a kind of second municipal chamber. The father often and gladly discussed politics with his sons, but always in an open atmosphere. The fact that only his son Joseph followed him into the Centre Party was therefore not a problem. The older brother Hermann became a member of the left-liberal German Democratic Party DDP, while the younger brother Alois joined the Social Democratic Party SPD and was a member of the Baden State Parliament from 1923 to 1925. The future Weimar coalition thus sat together at the Wirth family table every evening. Wirth's father, whom he considered a political role model, died in 1911. In the same year, he himself became a member of the Citizens' Committee in Freiburg. Just 1 year later, he was elected to the city council, and only 2 years after that, at the age of just 34, he was a member of the Reichstag. At the outbreak of war, he would actually have been young enough for military service. However, Wirth suffered from a heart condition and was therefore unfit for service. Nevertheless, wanting to contribute, he volunteered for the Red Cross and served in military hospitals from 1914 to 17, caring for the wounded and maimed. So when he later spoke about war, he knew what he was talking about, unlike many others. While he wasn't a pacifist, he could be called a pragmatic peace politician. In 1917, after a serious lung illness, he left the medical corps and instead took up his seat in the Reichstag. During a Reichstag debate in June 1918, he also championed the sometimes insufficiently appreciated medical service. This is printed in source 2 on page 62. Here too, quiet heroism was at work, and I would like to recommend to the War Ministry that it also address the care and support, even after the war, of the nurses and orderlies who, in the service of the fatherland, sacrificed their lives and health for years with pure idealism and charity. Wirth was a gifted speaker. He delivered rousing speeches and captivated his audience. This quickly propelled him into the leadership of the Center Party. He is considered one of the best, if not the best, speakers among the chancellors of the Weimar Republic. When the revolution broke out at the end of 1918, he assumed the office of finance minister in the revolutionary government of Baden. In 1920, he became Reich Finance Minister under Konstantin Fehrenbach. From the outset, he was a staunch defender of the Republic. Among the Center Party chancellors, he is considered the strongest advocate for the Republic. He himself aligned himself with the left-wing working-class faction of the Center Party and was regarded as a capable liaison to the Social Democratic Party SPD. When Konstantin Fehrenbach resigned in the spring of 1921 due to the London reparations ultimatum, a new functional government had to be hastily assembled, much like in 1919, to deal with the ultimatum. Wirth led a Weimar coalition of the SPD, the Center Party and the DDP, which, however, lacked a majority in the Reichstag. Prior to this, Wirth had won an internal vote in a parliamentary group meeting against the future West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Otherwise, Adenauer might have become Chancellor. Adenauer never forgave his fellow party member for this defeat. Wirth relied on the trust of the Center Party, the Social Democratic Party SPD, and above all, Reich President Friedrich Ebert. On the very day of his appointment, May 10, 1921, he pushed the London ultimatum through the Reichstag by a vote of 220 to 172, thus preventing the Allied occupation of the Ruhr. I discussed the details of this ultimatum in episode 49 about Konstantin Fehrenbach. For a time, Wirth served as his own finance minister and foreign minister. Like his predecessors, he inherited numerous problems. One of these was the Third Silesian uprising. The plebiscite there had resulted in a 60-40 vote in favor of Germany. This, however, led to fighting between Polish paramilitaries and German Freikorps in Upper Silesia. The foreign troops present remained either inactive or ineffective. In his government declaration of June 1, 1921, quoted in source 2 on page 87, he stated, "A program is expected of the new government. I want to summarize this program briefly in 3 words. These 3 words are understanding, reconstruction, and reconciliation. This applies to foreign policy as well as domestic policy. By accepting the ultimatum, a final chapter has been written for some of the previous struggles, and our policies have been set on a specific course. The intention of the Reich government is unambiguous and clear. It intends to fulfill its commitments conscientiously and unequivocally." Wirth therefore abandoned the obstructionist strategy of his predecessors. This tactic, which involved only feigning acceptance of the Allied demands and then doing everything possible to circumvent them, had failed. Germany simply lacked the necessary power. Moreover, the Allies were threatening ever larger occupations of German territory. Wirth instead wanted to accept the demands and demonstrate that implementing them was impossible, and then reach a reparations compromise with the Entente. This strategy is similar to the one employed by Chancellor Heinrich Brüning about 10 years later, which ultimately proved successful. On August 26, 1921, Finance Minister Matthias Erzberger was assassinated by right-wing terrorists associated with the organization Consul. This organization had emerged from the Erhard Brigade, which had participated in the Kapp Putsch a year earlier. Its aim was to eliminate politicians it disliked through assassinations. Anyone considered a fulfillment politician, that is, a politician willing to comply with the Allied demands, was on their death list. Because Matthias Erzberger had signed the armistice in November 1918, he was considered a November criminal in these circles. The fact that he had to take on this task, as the leading German military figures were shirking their responsibilities, was deliberately ignored. On the French side, Field Marshal Foch had attended this meeting. A more fitting counterpart would therefore have been Field Marshal von Hindenburg, not Erzberger, a minister without portfolio. On October 21, 1921, Upper Silesia was divided between Germany and Poland following the plebiscite and the end of hostilities. The division was unsatisfactory for both Poland and Germany, as both sides had laid claim to the entire territory. It caused outrage throughout Germany and significantly reduced the willingness to cooperate with the Western Allies. Wirth fought a losing battle and resigned in protest, but Reich President Ebert refused to let him go and reappointed him to form a government. Wirth formed a new minority cabinet comprised of the Centre Party, the German Democratic Party DDP, and the Social Democratic Party SPD. In the end, it was more of a cabinet reshuffle. A fundamental point about reparations. Would the German economy have been capable of handling the reparation demands? Probably not, but it could have done more than what was ultimately paid. The indicators of the German economy were quite poor. Steel production, at the time an important indicator of economic performance, was only at 75% of its 1913 level in 1922. And that was already higher than in the immediate post-war years. The loss of Upper Silesia and the Saarland, then two centers of heavy industry, had significantly weakened the German economy. Since the recipient countries also insisted on payment in gold marks rather than paper marks or goods, gold had to be acquired using foreign currency. There had also already been a tax increase. Inflation rose steadily, although this was primarily attributable to the high war debts. But it was nonetheless a problem. Publicly, the reparations were blamed. And it must be admitted that the reparations had at least no positive impact on the stability of the currency. Ultimately, Wirth's policies received little support at any level of the Reich. Certainly, much more could have been achieved in terms of fulfilling reparations obligations if everyone had pulled together. But after all the events and decisions in Germany since November 1918 that the Germans had considered as humiliating, who would have been willing to publicly advocate for or enforce such a course of action? The acceptance of the London ultimatum at least ensured that Germany was once again allowed to participate as a full member in international conferences. An economic conference took place in Genoa in April and May 1922. Here, France attempted to draw the Soviet Union into the circle of reparations powers. To preempt this, secret negotiations were held between Germany and the Soviet Union, culminating in the Treaty of Rapallo on April 16, 1922. Germany and the Soviet Union recognized each other, renounced all claims against one another, and also agreed to secret military cooperation. This treaty, however, did not fall from the sky. It had a history. Since 1920-21, there had been more intensive contacts between Germany and the Soviet Union. Under the new Reichswehr chief, General von Seeckt, These contacts were intensified and led to a secret arms cooperation that contradicted the Treaty of Versailles. German know-how was used to build arms factories in the Soviet Union. Germany was allowed to secretly develop and test weapons there. Furthermore, training, particularly in the areas of air force and armored warfare, became possible for the Reichswehr outside of Germany. Chancellor Wirth was informed about these agreements, which were organized by the Reichswehr Ministry, but the Reich President was not. The signing of the treaty came as a great surprise to the public, the Western powers, and especially to Reich President Ebert. The head of state felt his foreign policy prerogatives had been violated. On page 88 of source 2, he is quoted as saying to Wirth, "How can you associate with these scoundrels?" The Western powers reacted with great anger, but ultimately could do nothing to stop it. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had achieved a victory. Instead of dubious prospects for reparations, it had secured military know-how from Germany. On June 24, 1922, Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau was also assassinated by right-wing terrorists. This time the outcry in the country was significantly greater than after Erzberger's murder. Rathenau too was considered a fulfillment politician by the OC terrorists and was even more hated because of his Jewish faith. To see him as a traitor is almost incomprehensible, given his work in the War Materials Department during the First World War. But I will discuss this in more detail when I talk about Walther Rathenau. Here, only the following passage from source 1, page 156 is quoted. Walther Rathenau shared with Joseph Wirth an unequivocal commitment to the Republic and a deeply felt sense of national identity tempered by a strong ethos and a sense of responsibility. Like Wirth, Rathenau subscribed to a policy of conditional fulfillment. Unlike the vast majority of German politicians, he did not think along the lines of a narrow, revisionist policy oriented toward a return to pre-war German hegemony. He envisioned a European reconstruction program that, through the expansion of economic cooperation, would reduce animosity between nations and lead to a decrease in social tensions. Rathenau was thus politically very close to British Prime Minister Lloyd George, basically thinking along the lines of European unification as it happened after the Second World War. Rathenau was already the second minister and close associate whom Wirth lost to an assassination. At this point, the background of the right-wing terrorist should perhaps be briefly explained. I quote here from source 1, pages 164 following. The real threat to the parliamentary system did not come from the left, but from the extreme right. It had the propagandistic support of parts of the DNVP, as Karl Helfferich's unrestrained attacks against Walther Rathenau proved. The conspiratorial secret societies, which recruited from the disbanded Freikorps and sought to undermine the Republic internally through secret trials, and externally, through systematic political assassinations, maintained close ties to the Reichswehr and found the sympathies of official circles not only within the Bavarian government. The assassination of Walther Rathenau on June 24, 1922 by members of the organization Konsul, which was the successor to the Erhard Brigade, represented a serious challenge to the Republic. Under pressure from public opinion, the government responded with a decree for the protection of the Republic, which it simultaneously submitted to the Reichstag as a law for the protection of the Republic. The judiciary, still entirely from the German Empire, was rather lenient in its dealings with right-wing enemies of the Republic. It only rigorously applied the powers of this law against those on the left. In a Reichstag speech 2 days after the assassination, Reich President Ebert spoke of, quote from source 2, page 88, bullet shots fired by cowardly murderers who, standing outside the community of the German people, felt this man and dealt Germany this disastrous blow. Wirth's passionate denunciation of the DNVP the day before became more famous when he said, quote from page 2, page 89, There stands the enemy, dripping his poison into the wounds of a people. There stands the enemy, and there's no doubt about it. This enemy is on the right. According to the minutes, this was met with thunderous and prolonged applause in the Reichstag, both from the center and the left, and from all the galleries. Helfferich had to hide from enraged members of the Reichstag from the left and center, having publicly railed against Rathenau just the day before the assassination attempt. In countless leaflets, brochures, and speeches, he had practically called for murder with the following Freikorps battle cry: "And I ask you to forgive me for uttering the racism and anti-Semitism in the following verbatim quote: Shoot Walther Rathenau, the goddamn Jewish swine." Only the USPD politician Julius Moses explicitly addressed the DNVP's anti-Semitism. Source 3 states on page 473, Julius Moses used quotations from a DNVP publication to illustrate the vicious way in which representatives of the German government were portrayed. Furthermore, Jew baiting was rampant at DNVP meetings. In secondary schools, students were indoctrinated with hatred of Jews, and Jewish classmates were systematically boycotted. Thus, the minds of children were instilled with the attitude that, through the brutalization of their entire worldview, inevitably led to the acts we are witnessing today. What particularly embittered Wirth about the accusations from the right wing was the charge that he and his associates were traitors who were selling out the fatherland. Yet it was precisely Wirth, as finance minister under Konstantin Fehrenbach, who had financially enabled the secret rearmament of the so-called Black Reichswehr. This had made it possible to maintain the armament and combat strength of the German armed forces significantly above the limits permitted by the Treaty of Versailles. This in turn had made the intervention of the Freikorps in the Third Silesian uprising possible in the first place. Otherwise, there would have been a risk that the Poles would simply have annexed the entire region. Source 3 states that Wirth was later proud to be called the father of the Black Reichswehr. Naturally, Wirth's activities had remained secret, which allowed the DNVP and the terrorists close to it to heap such accusations upon Wirth and his associates. As it turned out, Wirth was also on the OC's death list. How deeply patriotic Wirth actually was is demonstrated by the following passage from Source 3, pages 185 and following. Similarly, Joseph Wirth also strove for the creation of a large German state of social justice, international peace, and German happiness, stretching from Cologne to Vienna. The Republicans saw the unification of Germany and Austria as an opportunity to strengthen democracy while simultaneously demonstrating their national convictions. Therefore, not all calls for annexation during the Weimar era were harbingers of a Nazi Reich, as some historians have claimed. The assassination of Rathenau triggered a process of internal clarification within the DNVP, during which the radical anti-Semitic wing left the party and founded the insignificant German Nationalist Freedom Party. For a short time after the assassination, Wirth appeared strengthened, and he now enjoyed the support of not only the center but also the left. However, this did not last long. The Wirth government was the last to take an aggressive stance against the enemies of the Republic. This approach was significantly diminished under subsequent governments. On September 27, 1922, the Independent Social Democratic Party USPD reunited with the Social Democratic Party SPD and adopted its former name SPD. This gave the Weimar coalition a comfortable absolute majority in the Reichstag. However, the influx of numerous socialists gave the coalition a leftward list, prompting leading center party politicians to demand the German People's Party DVP join a grand coalition as a counterbalance. Joseph Wirth embraced this demand and staked his political fate on it. This proved to be a mistake. As before, the SPD and DVP could not agree on cooperation. Wirth, now publicly defeated, resigned. Reich President Ebert, who had lost confidence in Wirth after the Treaty of Rapallo, did not regret the young chancellor's departure. Adding to Wirth's woes was the ever-increasing inflation, which was destroying more and more wealth and exacerbating social tensions in the country. Wirth had attempted to stabilize the finances with emergency decrees, but the costly resistance in Upper Silesia had further fueled inflation. At the time of Wirth's resignation, Germany was on the verge of hyperinflation, which reached its peak in the autumn of 1923. In 1942, Wirth said in retrospect, quote from source 2, page 90, "I was brought down by Ebert's distrust over the Treaty of Rapallo. Ebert also felt slighted that during my chancellorship the focus of policy was no longer on him. He always underestimated the chancellor's position and always intervened forcefully himself, even in personal matters." Was Wirth perhaps ultimately too powerful and too independent for the Reich president? Wirth was only 43 years old when he was forced to resign. He remained politically active, advocating primarily for the defense and anchoring of the Republic within society. He became an active member of the Reich banner Black, Red, Gold, founded the Republican Union, and together with Paul Löbe of the SPD and Ludwig Haas of the DDP, published the journal The German Republic. He continued to be a staunch advocate of the center-left. Therefore, it was all the more painful for him to witness the alliance between the Center Party and the DNVP in 1925. As a symbolic gesture, he resigned from the Center Party parliamentary group for a year. In the 1920s, Wirth had a relationship with Christine Teusch, a member of the Center Party. The engagement was broken off, but the two remained friends. His relationship with his own family, especially his brothers and their families, became all the closer. However, he suffered a devastating blow in 1926 when his mother died. He took over the family home in Freiburg and continued to live there. In a political essay in 1928, Wirth wrote that the new German state had already achieved much, but still faced a difficult path ahead. In 1929, he returned to the forefront of politics when he became Reich Minister for the occupied territories under SPD Chancellor Hermann Müller. This referred to the territories in West Germany occupied by the Western Allies, which had special representation in the Reich government. In this capacity, he participated in two conferences dealing with the Young Plan, a revised version of the reparations agreement. However, his appointment as vice-chancellor was rejected by Reich President Hindenburg. When Heinrich Brüning of the Center Party became chancellor in 1930 and formed a significantly more right-wing government, Wirth became Minister of the Interior. This came as a surprise to many. However, since Brüning was dependent on the SPD's support after the 1930 elections, Wirth was able to serve as a liaison to the SPD. Source 3 states on page 312, Joseph Wirth embodied the willingness to cooperate with the SPD and the DDP like almost no one else in his party. When President Hindenburg pressed for an even more right-wing shift in the cabinet in October 1931, Wirth was dismissed. In March 1933, when Hitler's Enabling Act, which granted the Nazi leader unlimited dictatorial power, was up for debate, Wirth vehemently argued against its passage in the Center Party. However, he was outvoted and voted in favor due to party discipline in the Reichstag. A day later, he fled Germany, fearing arrest. Until 1935, his life was very unsettled. He traveled through several of Germany's neighboring countries and also to the USA, attempting to educate the nations of the world about the rampant anti-Semitism in Germany and the true nature of the Nazi regime. In 1935, he settled in Paris, France, but moved to Lucerne, Switzerland in 1939. From there, he tried to support the education of his younger brother Alois' sons, despite the limited means available to him. One of his nephews, Karl, was killed in action as a soldier in 1942. From Switzerland, Wirth established contacts with the resistance around Chief of the General Staff Franz Halder and maintained close ties with other exiles, such as the long-serving Prussian Prime Minister Otto Braun of the SPD and the later SPD Prime Minister of Bavaria Wilhelm Högner. With them he published the memorandum Democratic Germany, Principles and Guidelines for German Reconstruction in a Democratic, Republican, Federalist and Cooperative Spirit in May 1945. Full of energy, he wanted to return to Germany as soon as possible after the war ended, but the French blocked his return to Freiburg until 1948. There was no official explanation for this. It is suspected that they did not want him to play a serious political role in post-war Germany. Wirth quickly became the adversary of Konrad Adenauer, who advocated for consistent Western integration and rearmament. Wirth considered this detrimental to potential reunification and instead, entirely in keeping with the spirit of Rapallo, promoted understanding with Moscow and a non-aligned policy independent of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. He traveled to Moscow and East Berlin for talks, meeting with, among others, Prime Minister Wilhelm Pieck, whom he knew from the Weimar Republic. Wirth even addressed the East German People's Chamber and frequently appeared at peace conferences. At one such conference in December 1952 he posed the following question. See also Source 2, page 129. Isn't it a human duty, a Christian duty, a patriotic duty to talk to the East instead of shooting at each other? With this attitude, he anticipated the détente policy of the 1970s. However, neither West nor East Germany was ready for it in the 1950s. Wirth did not join the CDU, but instead founded the splinter party League of Germans. In 1953, he ran in the Bundestag election with this party, together with the All-German People's Party, which was led by the future West German President Gustav Heinemann. The alliance, however, only achieved 1.2% of the vote and therefore won no seats. The 1953 election was instead a great success for Wirth's opponent, Konrad Adenauer, and his coalition of the CDU, CSU, FDP and DP. In West Germany, Wirth was considered an outsider and a sympathizer of the Communist Party, even though his initiative led to the release of 100 political prisoners in East Germany, and he opposed Soviet policies. He never again received his pension as a former chancellor and minister, which the Nazis had revoked, even in West Germany. His contacts to East Germany and the Soviet Union were partly to blame. The CIA even suspected him of being a Soviet agent. He lived in poverty with relatives in Freiburg. He received small financial assistance from East Germany. He was awarded the East German Peace Medal and the Stalin Peace Prize. He suffered another political defeat in 1952 when his home state of Baden was incorporated into the newly formed state of Baden-Württemberg. He had passionately advocated for Baden to remain an independent state. He died of heart failure on January 3, 1956, at the age of 77. A few finishing words. So who was Joseph Wirth? He was not only Germany's youngest chancellor, but also the most passionate Republican the Weimar Republic had ever had in the office of Reich Chancellor. Wirth attempted to act boldly in foreign policy, but ultimately failed due to the internal political divisions within society. Among his greatest achievements was the Treaty of Rapallo of 1922, which ended Germany's isolation and awakened in the West the specter of the alliance of parias between Germany and the Soviet Union, although this only led to concrete concessions to Germany a few years later. I can only say that in my opinion, Joseph Wirth was someone who didn't shy away from responsibility in difficult times and sought a way out of a very difficult situation for the entire German nation. Like his predecessors, he inherited a terrible situation. He was confronted with unfair accusations, had to accept his party's misguided decisions more than once, and ultimately had to leave his country. His cry, "The enemy is on the right," was the painful realization of a patriot that the greatest danger to the country came from extremists, not from abroad. Nevertheless, he remained true to his ideals throughout his life and continued to fight even on seemingly lost causes. After the Second World War, he was able to return to his homeland, but he never achieved further political success. Instead, he was forced to watch as his rival Konrad Adenauer triumphed. Had he lived to see the 1970s, he would likely have felt his views confirmed. Joseph Wirth teaches us that even the greatest foreign policy successes are worthless if democracy is not passionately defended at home. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.